like you know.
What is going on, Baylor Sports fam? It's your favorite history teacher, Mr. Parker Ainsworth, here in another edition of F in Sports, and it is another midterm episode brought to you by my bookie. To get a look at some college basketball stuff today, we got my good buddy Andy Patton coming on to talk all about the Zags and how they are the title favorites on my bookie at plus 470 right now. So without further ado, let's dive in. All right, we're joined here today by Andy Patton of the, I almost said Score Zags Score, the Locked on Zags podcast. Still all Gonzaga all the time.
Yeah, that's right.
How you doing, Andy?
I'm good, Parker. Thanks for having me on.
For sure. Today, we're brought by my bookie. My bookie wants to remind you that championships continue around the corner with my bookie. Head to my bookie today to win this March Madness. Place your bets on whomever you think will take home the crown. Be sure to use code FNSports, double your deposit up to $1,000 US. Number one ranked Gonzaga are a great pick currently. Be sure to put whatever cash you have down on them. My bookie takes all types of well-known cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Put some down on the running Zags at plus 470. Double your deposit. Use code FNSports on my bookie today. Bet anything, anytime, anywhere with my bookie. So I don't know what point in your life you got to be a Gonzaga fan, Andy. I know you went there, right? Mm-hmm. Would you have ever thought that in late February they were going to be the number one favorite for the NCAA? Like that feels like crazy.
No, it's wild, man. My senior year at Gonzaga was the first year they were ever ranked number one overall. It was in 2013 when that happened, and that was a year where no team wanted to be number one. It was similar to what happened earlier in this year, where everybody was just losing constantly, and so now this team obviously is in a much different spot, and last year's team obviously kind of ran the table as the number one team, undefeated for the entire season until the championship game. It's been wild to see the progression of this program to now a team that is expected to be in the top five at the start of every season and is more or less not necessarily expected to be ranked number one, but very often gets to that point because they just don't lose a lot of basketball games. And so, yeah, I don't know that I would have told you, even in 2013, when they were the number one ranked team for the first time, that I thought that we'd be looking at a team, making two national championship games in a 4-year span and looking like a very likely candidate to do it for the third time in 5 years this year, assuming things go well in March.
Third time in 5 years, and frankly, I have a really good argument to they might have made it had the 2020 tournament happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess I gotta ask, as the fan and the alum, you mentioned 2013, what's been different for basically a decade now? I mean, they're in the likes of the Kansases and the Kentuckys and the Blue Bloods, and they weren't before, for many, many years before that.
Well, I'm glad you bring that up, because I think a lot of people who interact with Gonzaga or talk about their fans and their place amongst the college basketball greats, they view this team as a team that has been really good for 22 years, but hasn't won a national championship. And they kind of view it as this team always disappoints in March, and they're always losing, and they've, losing the second round a bunch. And there's a very clear difference. And Ken Pomeroy, who doesn't just have a site of stats, he actually is a writer as well. And he wrote a really good piece for I believe a newspaper in Salt Lake City, talking about how people need to differentiate the Gonzagas. There was Gonzaga from I think he said up to 2015 or 2014, something like that. And then the Gonzaga that has existed since then. And the Gonzaga since then, since 2016, when they went to the national championship for the first time, that's the program that has been perennially elite. So that's the program that 90% of the time that Gonzaga has been ranked number one in the school's history happened in the past 5 years. This is not a program that has been a blue blood, a legitimate championship contender for 20 years. If that was the case, then they would be a very big disappointment for having not won one. But they have in fact only really been at this level for half a decade or so. And the success they've had in that half decade, making two national championship games, making another run to the Elite Eight, never not making it to the Sweet 16 in the last 7 seasons, that is the kind of program that they have been lately. And like you said, it's not what they were before. And a big difference for that is not just recruiting really well internationally, which they have done for a very long time. You look back on your Roni Turiafs and Kelly Olynyk and Kevin Pangos and some, even Domantas Sabonis, who was kind of right before that timeline. They always recruited really well internationally. Tommy Lloyd, who's now the head coach at Arizona, had a big part to do with that. But then they started getting a lot better with the domestic recruits. You saw your Zach Collins was the first 5-star in Gonzaga's history. That surprises people. That was 2016, first 5-star in school history. They had not had one until Zach Collins.
You mean Rockets legend Kelly Olynyk was not a 5-star?
Not a 5-star recruit. Yeah, exactly. And then, you know, obviously Jalen Suggs after that, Chet Holmgren now, you know, they're looking at Anthony Black for next year, and some of the 2023 guys they're identifying are 5-star recruits. So the recruiting ticked up in a way that it took a long time for that to happen, but now you're starting to see them really bring in these kids and obviously have demonstrated conclusively that they can turn players into legitimate NBA talents. There's, I think, 11 players in the NBA this year from Gonzaga. Many of them were not high-level recruits, including Kelly Olynyk, including, you know, guys like Killian Tilly, Joel Ayayi, who are not even top 200 recruits internationally, which is a little harder to pin down ranking-wise, but still obviously tremendously successful at turning those kids into pros. So that has helped them continue to recruit well internationally, also recruit well domestically. Then you start to see a team with multiple 5-star recruits on it like they have right now. And then at that point, the expectations should be pretty darn high, and they are.
Completely. I think it's also, you know, we mentioned like the last, you keep going to a half decade. I guess I'm going all the way back to 13, but I did pull it up, the AP high on Sports Reference page as you go back. It's AP high has been 1 for however many years in a row now. And then 2013, 13-14 was also a 1. But then it really, the years before that, like there's a 4 for what I'm assuming must have been Morrison's senior.
Yeah.
There's a 4 about 5 or 6 years ahead of that. But that's as high as it gets, right? And so it has been this like quick ascendant since then.
Yeah.
You mentioned the 5-star recruits coming in fairly recently. I think of Suggs as being a little bit different, and how like that transformed as a one and done kind of guy, and how that really, you know, puts them in the Dukes, puts them in the Carolinas, puts them in the Kentuckys. Am I wrong in thinking that Suggs? Would you go before Suggs in that?
No, I think it is Suggs, and it's interesting because I mentioned Collins already. Obviously, not only was he the first 5-star recruit, but he was also the first one and done. But he was a very different scenario. He was a 5-star recruit, but he did not get the 5-star label until like right before his high school career ended. He was basically a 4-star when he committed to Gonzaga, then had a really nice senior year, bumped up. Still counts, but it's a little bit different than Suggs, was labeled that since he was like a sophomore. Yeah. And then obviously, while Collins was a one and done, it was kind of unexpected that he'd be a one and done. He was a backup center on Gonzaga's roster. He didn't start. Shemek Karnowski was the starter at the center position for that team. So yes, he was a one and done, but he was not a program changing player the way that Suggs was. Suggs came in, you know, he committed to Gonzaga by like at a high school game on ESPN. That's something that had not happened in Gonzaga's history. He pulled off his...
Gonzaga didn't have a whole lot of games on ESPN.
Nope. No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the fact that they had one of their high school guys on ESPN was very unusual. He came in with the expectation immediately he was going to be a one and done. There was never any, is he going to come back? That was never part of the conversation for him. The only other player in Gonzaga history that has been the case is Chet Holmgren this year. The only 2 guys who were ever conclusively, without a shadow of a doubt, one and done players. And that's going to continue to happen. And there's 2 other 5-star players on this team right now in Hunter Salas and Nolan Hickman. Both of them, it's very, very up in the air. I suspect both of them are coming back, but it's very not evident that they're going to do that. And that's kind of something that Gonzaga has the ability to not only get 5-star recruits who are clearly, obviously one and done players, but they can also get players who might stick around for a couple of years who play at that level out of high school too, which when you can kind of build a roster of, you know, that level of talented players, you got 2 5-star guards coming off the bench. That's a pretty unique situation that really does cement them as like a legit blue blood. Not a lot of programs in college basketball have that level of talent 8 deep on their roster. And that's kind of where this team is at right now.
Well, and maybe it's because I'm also based out of Texas and I've gotten to see the Anthony Black kid a lot. I would imagine Anthony Black would also be, if they land him, would be the same kind of recruit.
Yes, most likely.
As a 6'7" guard that distributes the ball, handles the offense, etc. There just aren't many of those around. Right. I will say, though, it's interesting once you get in the one and done game and they see it go well. Like Suggs is playing well in the NBA right now. The Magic aren't great, but like he's playing fine, right? Like that only keeps the wheel going. As a Gonzaga guy for the duration of this run, is that weird? Is that good weird, bad weird? Like, what do you think about that?
It's different. Certainly, I think the fans struggled a little bit at first with having Suggs on. Like, they didn't struggle with him personally because he's fantastic and a great steward of the program and everything. But there was people who were a little worried, like, are we going to get into this too much? And I think what Coach Few's really good at and what the staff seems to be really good at is they're very good at kind of IDing when players are going to reach their peak and like kind of timing it well. Like this staff seemed to know that a guy like Joel Ayayi was a couple year project and then he's going to pop and be like this really good player for them in a few years. And he was. Rui Hachimura didn't play like at all his freshman season, played a tiny bit as a sophomore as like a, super reckless end of the bench guy. And then as a junior, he exploded and was a, 9th overall pick in the draft. And so I think that they're very good at IDing which kind of guys are going to do that. And that's why I think, you can have 2 5-star guards on your bench. And yeah, maybe there's some frustration that they're not playing as much as they thought that they would. Hunter Salas played 8 minutes against Santa Clara on Saturday. I have to imagine that was not what he expected. And a lot of fans were asking me questions of like, why isn't he playing as much? And I get that. And that's a challenge. And there's a whole discourse on Twitter about him. And like, he could have gone to Creighton. Creighton wanted him really badly. He's from Nebraska. And they're like, he'd be playing 35 minutes a night at Creighton. It's like, yeah, there's no debate about that, but that may not necessarily be the best thing for him, because on this roster next year, assuming he comes back, he's going to be really, really, really good. And I think the staff is good at finding guys who are willing to buy into that. Nobody shoots 100%. Sometimes they miss and they get a guy who doesn't fit the program and leaves, and that's fine. That's the nature of college sports. But Gonzaga is pretty dang good at this. They're pretty good at finding guys that buy into the pro. Even Suggs and Holmgren, yes, they're one and dones, but they're not, I don't want to say typical one and dones, but they don't have the same, we've seen a lot of one and dones who are more me focused and were willing or went to programs where they could be the guy and do all of the scoring, do everything. And those teams, don't make the NCAA tournament. We talk about Ben Simmons, we talk about Markelle Fultz at UW. Like there are situations where that happens, and Gonzaga is not recruiting guys like that. Chet, you watched the Gonzaga-Texas game, one of the first games of the year. Chet had 2 points and 5 rebounds in that game, and everybody said, "What happened to Chet?" What happened to Chet is that Drew Timme had 37. Like that's what happened. They did not need him. Yeah, and a lot of first, number 1 recruit in the country, second game of the season, first big game ever that they've played in college. They may not settle for a role where they score 2 points and grab 5 rebounds. Chet did, and that's the kind of stuff that's going to pay off for this team in March.
Well, and to be fair, every mock draft has Chet in the top 3 at lowest, right?
Yeah.
It's not like it's impacting him too much there.
Mm-hmm.
I also look at the roster and like, is Hunter Salas playing just under 15 minutes a game, and could he be playing 35 minutes a game somewhere else? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He could also be a 2-and-done guy at Gonzaga and walk away with real shots at 2 rings.
Yeah.
And like that, that's also valuable to people.
Mm-hmm.
Like the Jalen Suggs folklore, like going number 4 overall, was impacted by hitting a big shot in the Final Four, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
He probably still would have been a top 5 pick, but it certainly was a no questions asked thing once it's like, oh, he also has this like it factor in a big moment. And I think that is valuable to find someone that can win and play on a winner. Not to say Creighton wouldn't have won if they had Hunter Salas on the team, but it's not quite the same program. They're kind of more where Gonzaga was in the first half of that 22 years, right? They're good mid-major. You're not surprised when they win games, but like, I don't expect them to win a title.
Right.
On looking at the title this year, Gonzaga is the favorite on my bookie at plus 470. You mentioned you lost a coach to Arizona. They're third on this list at plus 930. So that could be an interesting Final Four type matchup. You would know each other pretty well, I would imagine. Chet Holmgren is a top 3 pick. 2 other top 3 picks. Auburn's at plus 1175. Purdue's at plus 1050. As you look at this, do you think Gonzaga's got as good a chance as anyone? Should they be the favorite by so? I mean, they're almost double the number 2 team right now on this book. Are they really that much better than everybody else?
I'm surprised they have that much better odds than everybody else. I'm not surprised they are first. Obviously, they're the number 1 ranked team in the country right now. That was unanimous last week in the AP poll. You would typically expect that the number 1 ranked team in mid-February would be the title favorite. So I expect that. I'm a little surprised at how much they are the favorite, but I think they should be the favorite. And I think, you look at this team and you look at last year's team, and I think a lot of people who haven't been following super closely this year, who are just now starting to look at the betting lines, or just now starting to look at, what the bracket might shake out like. They're going to look and be like, well, last year's team had Jalen Suggs, they had Corey Kispert, they had Joel Ayayi. Like, their 3 starting backcourt guys are all in the NBA now. There's no way they're going to be as good. And that's not true. Their roster this year is different in a very considerable way. Obviously, Andrew Nembhard has stepped into a significant role as the leader, the pick and roll expert. His outside shot has improved as the season has gone on. He's one of the 3 best point guards in college basketball. I think that's borderline indisputable. Not one of the 3 best draft prospects, but in terms of his actual current basketball ability, he's extraordinary. Rasir Bolton, grad transfer from Iowa State, has been extraordinary, shooting 45% from 3, a significant part of this offense. And then the biggest thing, hands down, the biggest, most notable thing is, of course, Chet Holmgren. Gonzaga's biggest weakness on last year's roster was depth, front court depth, and rim protection. And what cost them a lot against Baylor was the physicality of Baylor's guards really hampered Gonzaga's guards, and that was kind of the most notable takeaway. But Gonzaga also had no rim protection. These guards from Baylor, who were extremely good, all NBA players, they got to the rim with ease. Drew Timme was not a shot blocker. Anton Watson is not a shot blocker. That's not their role. Corey Kispert was their 4 last year. He's not a shot blocker. And then, they were exposed in the pick and roll. Drew Timme not great at moving laterally. But on this year's roster, Chet Holmgren, not only is he an elite rim protector, his shot block numbers are through the roof. His block percentage numbers are through the roof. And his ability to impact shots, even if he's not directly blocking them, is staggering. It kind of needs to be watched to fully understand how great he is at that, but he is incredible. But he also moves well on the perimeter. He's better lateral defensive player out there. It's harder to expose him in that regard. And if Drew Timme is getting exposed in pick and roll situations and Chet's still on the floor, those are not going to turn into automatic easy buckets. He's going to erase a handful of those. And then Chet's emergence as an offensive player, especially in conference play, has been incredible. He was a good transition 3-point shooter in the non-conference, but I think he shot like 17% in half-court threes in the first half of the season. And there was some concern of is he going to be a legitimate spot-up, pick-and-pop type shooter? And he has been incredible. Since WCC play started, he's shooting over 50% from 3, I believe, or around there. He's been just an absolute machine as an offensive player. He gets to the rim with ease. He finishes 70% of his shots around the rim because of his frame, his wingspan. He's got a lot of touch. You've seen some of those Dirk Nowitzki type fadeaways, which was a specialty of his in high school. And having a player like that who fills so many of the holes that were on Gonzaga's roster last year makes it hard not to think, hey, they fixed some of the problems on last year's roster and now they're just as good and they're peaking at the right time. Again, it's not surprising that they're the title favorite.
Well, and you mentioned filling holes from last year and intentionally picking their spots to get better at it. We talked in pre-production about Drew Timme is not really a modern big, and he may be a 4-year college guy. He's a great college basketball player, iconic in so many college basketball kinds of ways. I don't mean to give game away. You kind of liken him to Leitner almost. He's an easy to hate, he's an easy to love kind of guy. Depends what side of the ball you're on. Holmgren is the opposite of all of that. Holmgren is completely the modern prototype for a big. He's a rim protecting guy that you mentioned. He shoots the 3 well. I think I've got him at 46%, but obviously that's as good as anyone in the NBA. It's a step in, I guess, but whatever. And he's also a bajillion feet tall. He's also crazy long. He also, because he's so tall, passed the ball well across the defense in the short roll. It's interesting to have that dynamic back and forth there. And then they have, because they're not playing guys like Salas, they've got veteran guards as well,
right? Which
always helps in March. You mentioned Baylor last year, a 1-game sample, so that may not have been a blowout if you played a 7-game series, right? Not that I anticipate them getting blown out in any March Madness game this year, but part of the reason these odds are favorable now are, because we don't know the bracket, right? We don't know the path. Is there a team you see out there in watching college basketball, like, man, I don't want to see them to the last game if possible?
There are a couple. I did a segment on my podcast, two episodes where I kind of talked on the 5 or 6 teams that I think really present legitimate challenges for Gonzaga. And they're not necessarily the best teams. I think Purdue's a really good basketball team. I think Gonzaga handles Purdue fairly well because Purdue struggles defensively because they don't play their bigs at the same time. They have 2 really good bigs, and everybody says, oh, they have 2 bigs. Gonzaga has 2 bigs. It's but Drew Timme and Chet Holmgren play 30 minutes together a lot of the time, and their bigs don't do that. And so I think that presents unique matchup. You mentioned one of them, Arizona. Tommy Lloyd, obviously super familiar with Mark Few. He basically took Mark Few's offense and said, what if I just do this with all of Sean Miller's old recruits at Arizona? And without having to do anything else, that team catapulted to being the second or third best team in the country. Like, that is incredible that he was already able to do that.
I don't mean to sound like a nobody done watching this. I admittedly live in Texas, and
Yeah, sure.
They're going to play a lot of West Coast time games. I haven't watched them much. What is going on there? Is it really just Gonzaga 2.0 with Power 5 recruits? Like, what's happening?
A bit. They're running a lot. They're running more. Like, they're getting out in transition a ton. I think they're third in the NCAA in tempo. I think Gonzaga's second, and there's a smaller team that's first. And so that was not Sean Miller's kind of MO at Arizona. And so they're getting out in transition more. Their roster was really stacked to begin with. Ben Mathurin is an incredible 6'7" guard. We talked about how rare those guys are. Tubelis, a Lithuanian big man, 6'11" guy who can handle the basketball as well. So Tommy Lloyd basically just said, we get the rebound, we're going. Everybody on this team can handle the ball. Everybody can move. So we're just going to run. He turned Kirk Kriisa, who was a really inconsistent point guard, into a very, very good, but still sometimes inconsistent point guard. It's been fun to watch kind of that development. And then they have a great rim protecting big man in Christian Koloko, who averages 3-ish blocks per game. One of the best, I mean, legitimately alongside, Walker Kessler from Auburn and Chet, of course, he's one of the best rim protectors in the country. And yeah, Tommy's obviously a very good coach. It'll be interesting to see what he does when he starts getting his own recruits as well. But the fact that he turned around a team of, good players who disappointed in the last year under Miller to turn them around into this has been really remarkable. And they would give Gonzaga hell. It would be a barn burner if those two teams played it. And anybody who confidently tells you which team would win is lying to you, because it would be a toss up. They could play 100 times and I think they'd win 50 times each. Well,
and coaching matchup aside there, because that is half the fun there. I think it's interesting to think about like the future of that Arizona team, because they pull in a Gonzaga system style coach. When Arizona has been their best, it's because they're pulling in Southern California kids. I mean, LA gold mine, right? Yeah. And like, if you can do Southern California, LA talents, times the like coaching strategies that make Gonzaga good before they got these 5-star guys. Yeah, you could be building a real power there. You mentioned Bard Burner. I double checked the stats. I was clicking around just now. Those are the two fastest playing teams in terms of possessions per game in college basketball. Like, it would be fast. It'd be a lot of fun, frankly, as a guy watching the game with no interest.
It'd be stressful as heck for all Gonzaga fans, but it would be so fun to watch. Just a great basketball game in general.
You're not too worried about Purdue, you said. Are you at all worried about Kentucky? I feel like Kentucky is in this thing. You're in, you're out. Yeah. I had to coach against their point guard, Sevier Wheeler, once upon a time, and he's lightning fast. He's not very big. I would think you could handle him from a size perspective, but he gets out on the break really quickly. And then maybe it's because I'm a Southerner. I'm always scared of Kentucky basketball. Like I just always will be, always have been. So are you not as worried about them, or is it just not the same as Arizona?
Kentucky was on my list for sure. They're a really talented team, obviously. A well-coached team, depending on how you feel about Calipari, but still obviously very, very well-coached, very successful team. I think they're not as big. I mean, to be fair, there's very few teams that are as big as Gonzaga. So it's kind of like using that as an argument is a little bit unfair, because Gonzaga starts two guys who are 7 feet tall and bring Anton Watson, who's 6'10", off the bench. Obviously, as Ty Washington goes, they go. He's a big part of what they do. He's had some injuries. We've seen how significantly that impacts them when he's not playing. He would be a problem for the Zags just because of his speed. And his floor vision is incredible. You mentioned Wheeler. He's obviously fantastic as well. This is a team that could give them some trouble. I'm looking at their lineup right now, and of their rotation, they really don't play anybody over 6'9". So that's what it's going to come down to, is how do they defend the paint? Do they double Drew right away? And if they do, does Gonzaga's shooters step up? Because if Gonzaga comes into that game and Drew can kick the ball out and they can shoot 35-38% from three in that game, I'm not sure what Kentucky's going to do, because I don't think they can guard Drew Timme one-on-one. They don't have a lot of they don't have people on the roster who are going to be able to do that. Kentucky can get out and run with about everybody. Obviously, we haven't even mentioned Shubway, who's incredible player of the year candidate. And he's big and he's beefy and he's going to be the guy who defends Drew Timme, but he's just given up so much size that I think that I'm not saying Gonzaga wins every single time that these two teams play. I'm far from predicting that necessarily, but I think Gonzaga has enough of an advantage here that I would favor them to win. But if they if they have an off shooting night or Drew's not quite himself, then yeah, that one could definitely go either way.
And, he mentioned the double bigs, how unique that is for Gonzaga, because they have two bigs, but they don't have to both play at the low block. And that really is a special thing to have at one time. Auburn has two big guys too. I don't have to push about this. There's a big thing in my world in Rocket Twitter about, do you want Jabari? Do you want Chet? Do you want Paolo? Jabari versus Chet would be a ton of fun for me, frankly. Kessler is also a giant, right? Like 7'1", and him and Timme, I don't think he need, from a size perspective, I don't think he would need anyone pulled in to help him. He's a sophomore, but I guess he was also a top 25 recruit or whatever a couple years back, right? Does Auburn give you fits? Or are you feeling okay about that? Because what else you've got going on?
Yeah, Auburn was the first team I talked about when I was talking about teams that are a bit concerning. I want to shout out real quick that Walker Kessler seriously considered coming to Gonzaga this year, which would have been absolutely hilarious if this team had Chet Holmgren, Drew Timme, Anton Watson, and Walker Kessler as their front court. I'm not glad that he didn't, because I think he's one of the players who could give Gonzaga fits, but I'm certainly happy that he's having a remarkable season with Kentucky, one of the best shot blockers I've ever seen in my life. He's absolutely incredible. But yeah, Auburn presents interesting challenges because Walker and Chet kind of mitigate each other in an extent, to an extent. Obviously, Chet has a little bit more ability away from the rim, which could potentially create some problems. But I think for the Zags, if Chet's playing away from the rim, they'll just put Jabari Smith on him and they'll leave Walker down low to handle Drew. And they're one of the only teams that can do that. Now, Auburn's weakness is their guard play is wildly inconsistent. When Katie Johnson and Wendell Green are playing well, they are really tough to beat, but they're just not playing well consistently enough for this. I mean, we've seen them lose to some not good SEC teams. We've seen them struggle with some even worse SEC teams. They struggle with Georgia. Like they're when their guards aren't playing well, they really struggle. And that's, I mean, I watched them recently for a full 40 minutes. I can't remember exactly who they were playing, but they didn't look particularly good. It was not one of their better games. And it's like, you watch that and you're like, well, Gonzaga would beat this team by 15. But I've also seen, what they did to Alabama, a team that Gonzaga lost to on their worst game of the year. And I've seen them against plenty of other good teams as well. And they, when Jabari Smith is hitting shots, when Walker Kessler is dominating down low, and when Katie Johnson and Wendell Green are playing well, or Zep Jasper, who was out for a couple games, but he's a key part for this team as well, they're really, really good.
Definitely. And then obviously, I'm going to wrap up the comparison aspect here, but I'll talk about a couple of Big 12 teams. Baylor and Kansas have been kind of running the conference a little bit. I think of Kansas as a traditionally school that has a lot of big guys. I obviously don't have the Chet, and they don't have Timme, and that's a little bit different. But I do think of them as simply a big guy school. And so I guess maybe I'm favoring them a little bit more just on name recognition there. Baylor is at this program at this point, as weird to say as it is, that they just reload. It looks like they're again a top whatever team. You do a whole other podcast like the Baylor Rise the last 10 years. But are you scared at all about the Big 12? It feels like there's like an attrition thing happening in the Big 12 where like Tech is beating up and then they fall off, and then stuff like that too. Any Big 12 team give me a fits?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Tech. Obviously, Gonzaga played them earlier in the year and beat them, but they're a really good team. Like they're a team that they're well coached as well, and I think a team that could certainly present some problems for the Zags. Kansas is the team that I'm most worried about in the Big 12, and maybe I should be more worried about Baylor. They don't have a ton of size, which is again kind of what I always go to. But last year's roster didn't have a ton of size either, and they beat the tar out of the Zags in the national championship game. Of course, that was a non-Chet Holmgren team, and another factor for the Zags that we haven't talked about a ton here, but Anton Watson was on the roster last year and is on the roster this year, but he's a completely different player than who he was last year. Last year, he was really tentative offensively. This year, he's hunting his own shots. He's shooting over 60% from the field. He's a much bigger piece of the puzzle offensively than he was in the past. So the Zags added kind of 1.5 bigs to their rotation with Chet Holmgren and with an improved Anton Watson. But yeah, I mean, Baylor's obviously, they're really balanced scoring. They got like 3 guys over 13 points per game, 5 guys around 10 points per game. Kendall Brown, 6'8" freshman guards are going to be a problem 100% of the time.
Yeah.
He's an incredibly talented player. I think Baylor's Scott Drew, obviously a good coach. That always scares me a little bit too. But I lean Kansas because they have, again, they have so much depth, so much talent, top to bottom on this roster. Agbaji, obviously, so good. Another player of the year candidate for them. He's a matchup nightmare for the Zags. He's 6'5", so you can't really put like Hunter Salas is their best defensive player, but he's undersized to guard him and doesn't start or play significant minutes. Julian Strother, 6'7", he might be the option there, but I think Agbaji is just a lot more athletic than him and would still kind of push him around a little bit. You try one of the bigs. I don't know that that's going to work either. So yeah. I feel like if they play Kansas, that Agbaji is just going to go completely ham. But again, they do have size. Obviously, David McCormack's a really, really big dude, but they don't have a ton of size outside of that. Like somebody who's 6'8" or shorter is going to spend the majority of the game guarding either Drew or Chet. And again, height is not everything. And certainly there are 6'8" dudes who can push around, taller guys. But I think that Gonzaga would have a bit of an advantage in the paint against them. But with Agbaji and even with, Jalen Wilson's really talented young man as well. Remy Martin, obviously has been around for a while, super talented guy. So they would give Gonzaga some problems. Kansas is the kind of team that I think it's probably about 50-50. If they were to play a 7-game series, I think you're probably looking at 7, minimum 6, I think.
I see Agbaji, you said athletic. I think him as a big, strong kid. He's putting some guys around. I think they list him at 210 is what I'm seeing here, which makes sense after watching him play a little bit. It's like you're saying, though. I think of Kansas having all this height all the time. But they've got 2 6'10s, and that's really it. I don't know how they cover all the size and length. I keep thinking back as well that Gonzaga offers. Obviously, the fan in you would do it, but the analyst in you, the person that watches college basketball, are you putting 100 down on Gonzaga at plus 470, or what are you feeling about that?
Yeah, I think I would like to see the bracket. I'd like to see if they're going to get, a really, really tough draw where they run into a couple of barn burners. We're looking at a team that, they only have 2 losses on the year. They lost to Duke by 3, which a 3-point game is basically random variance. Gonzaga could have won that game. You can look at a lot of things Gonzaga did poorly in that game and think, well, they should have won by a lot more. You can also look at the fact that Banchero barely played in the second half and think, oh, Duke could have won by more. The Alabama game was just an absolute nightmare for the Zags. That was my dad's 60th birthday. His trip to fly him all the way out to watch them get pounded by the Crimson Tide was not particularly fun, but that's going to be the blueprint of teams that are going to try to be really physical with the Zags as soon as they cross half court, try to bother the guards, which what Baylor did in the national championship game. It's what Alabama did. It's what Duke did. You look at the Gonzaga's 3 losses over the last 2 years. They all had a similar recipe. So I think there's a recipe out there to beat the Zags, and teams are going to figure out how to do it. But Gonzaga has responded really well to that in the past, and they're really well coached. Yeah, I would probably put $100 on the Zags to win it all. I don't think those odds, I'm surprised at how much better they are than other teams. But I do think that this is the best team in college basketball, and having a player as dynamic as Chet in the front court and the way that Andrew Nembhard has played recently in the back court, you said it, dynamic playmakers and experienced guards are really the best things to have going into March. And the Zags have all of that. They have an 8-man rotation that really kind of encapsulates everything that you want out of a group of guys to go into this tournament and win it all.
Well, and outside of putting like $100 on the Abilene Christian Wildcats at plus 125,000, as far as actually getting money back on it, I think that until I see a bracket and there's 3 other top whatever teams that Gonzaga's 4th or whatever, I don't know how I'd pick against them because I'm kind of in the same vein as you. It was a coin flip with Duke, and I think in college basketball you're dealing with kids between the ages of 18 and 22. A game like Alabama happens, right? Could that also happen in March? Sure, but I'm not worried about it from earlier this year. People get worried about Gonzaga because they play the WCC schedule and then have to go play March Madness and play very tough competition very fast. I've heard your podcast. I've heard you talk about this is not the same WCC that it might have been in years where that's a concern.
Mhm.
Is that going to help them? Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah, so well, it's funny. The conversation on Twitter I saw recently that really made me happy. That this conversation about Gonzaga versus Arizona and how there's a realistic chance that Arizona could jump Gonzaga for the #1 seed in the West between, this was like posted a few days ago, like between now and March. And the reasoning was, well, Gonzaga's probably not going to lose, but if Arizona doesn't lose, they play a lot better schedule. And Gonzaga's final 2 games of the regular season, this Thursday and this Saturday, are against San Francisco and St. Mary's. And San Francisco per KenPom is, I believe, like 33rd, and St. Mary's is like 25th. And it was like, those are 2 quad 1 games, like indisputably quad 1 games. Arizona's final 2 games of the season, I do not remember who they are playing, but they are not, neither of them are quad 1 games. So it's just like, and this was a college basketball analyst. I'm obviously not going to call them out because it's disrespectful, but like the narrative that Gonzaga plays a bad schedule, it's obviously it's inferior to, you know, every other Power 5 conference's schedule. There's no debating that. There's no arguing with that necessarily, but it's just so ingrained in people to assume that every game Gonzaga plays in the WCC is bad. Every team they play is bad. And that is not true. Some of the teams that they play are bad. Pepperdine, they just played them recently. Bad, not a good basketball team. And it's a reality. Obviously, SEC teams, and you know, there's a few conferences that barely play bad games, but like Auburn plays some bad teams. They played Missouri and Georgia. They're bad teams. Pepperdine is worse, but they're still, at that point it's semantics. Like those teams are all not good. But this argument that like, oh, you know, Arizona is going to, they must play better teams the last week of the season than Gonzaga. Like, no, they don't. They don't. Like they're not playing worse teams.
By happenstance, like there would be years that would be the case because
right.
It just, this year it's just not like it's just not the case this year.
Yeah, I mean the WCC, St. Mary's absolutely will be an NCAA tournament team, barring they don't even have. Somebody said, well, unless they lose a bad game, they don't have any bad games left on their schedule. It's done. Like any game they lose from here on out would be at worst a quad 2 loss, and that's still going to get them in the NCAA tournament. BYU had an epic collapse, and that hurt the WCC's reputation a lot. And that's a bummer. But you know what? Sayonara to BYU. They're going to jump out of the WCC anyway, so we don't have to deal with them having their collapses. And then San Francisco, you know, they're a really, really good basketball team. And yeah, they lost to Portland, and that sucked. That hurt them badly because that was a quad 4 loss at home. The Pilots came into town and beat them. That, you know, shout out to Shante Leggins and the Portland team, because I'm happy that they're doing well, but that was a bad time for them to pull off a big victory in terms of hurting the reputation of the conference. But yeah, this is, you know, and then you have Santa Clara who is not going to make the NCAA tournament and had a really rough non-conference slate because their second best player had mono for 3 weeks and their third best player was out for 2 weeks with an injury, and they overlapped. And so they lost a bunch of games they shouldn't have lost, but that team is really good. I'm happily willing to say that there are 4 or 5 Power 5 schools that will make the NCAA tournament that I confidently would bet that Santa Clara at full health would beat them. Santa Clara would beat Oregon if they make the tournament. They would beat, they'd beat San Diego State, who's not a tournament or not a Power 5 school, but is a border, a bubble team as well. Like they're a good team. Jalen Williams, if you have not heard that name, he will be an NBA player in a couple of years, and you will be like, I don't know where this guy came from, but he's really, really talented. And so it's great to see the conference grow. It's never going to be as good as, the Power 5 conferences. That's okay. It's not even going to be as good as the Big East. Like it's hard to get to that level, but it is not the conference that it's been in the past. And it's helping Gonzaga that they're playing some of these, they're playing 2 of the best teams in the conference at the end of the season. That's a huge win for them because it's going to help sharpen them. They're playing, 2 teams that should and likely will be in the NCAA tournament.
Well, and it weirdly has to be this mutually beneficial rising tide lifts all boats thing, right? Where Gonzaga getting number 1, top caliber, recruits ends up leading to these other coaches saying, hey, when we play Gonzaga, you got a chance to be on TV. You should come to St. Mary. You should come to I think that's weirdly how that thing grows to be a rival to the Big East, and then theoretically, years down the road, it'd go onwards and upwards.
Yeah, I think if you're at this point, if you're trying to recruit to San Diego or to Pepperdine or Portland or whatever, and you can say, hey, look, not only do you get to play Gonzaga twice a year, but you get to play St. Mary's twice a year. and they make the tournament basically every year. You get to play San Francisco twice a year, and this is a team that, you know, went to the tournament last year. You get to play, you know, BYU. Obviously, BYU is about to leave, but for another couple of years, you get to play BYU. And if Santa Clara establishes themselves as a tournament caliber team, like now you get the argument of like you get 5 or 6 games against really good teams. Then your recruiting base starts to get a little bit better, and then it starts to grow, and it kind of, yeah, like you said, it goes from there.
Well, and frankly, I struggle to figure out why you'd have any issues recruiting to San Diego or Pepperdine. just
me too.
Don't get it. Andy, tell people where, once they put this $100 down and get upset about something, tell people where they can find Chet. Where can people hear you?
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me on Twitter at @ScoreZagsScore. Host a Locked On podcast, which you can find Locked On Zags podcast. You can find that at Locked On Zags. On Twitter, podcast is posted wherever. It's also a YouTube channel. So if you wanted to see me talking about Gonzaga basketball, you could go to the YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button there as well.
And you've got a whole new setup behind you, made for the visual aesthetic, guys.
I did. Yeah, we got it all set up just so that it would look a little bit better on the TV.
There you go. So go check them out at @ScoreZagsScore. Listen to the Locked On Zags podcast for all things Chet Holmgren, I'm sure, as we get down to the NBA draft kind of time and all that kind of fun stuff too. Anyway, thank you for coming by, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Parker. I appreciate it.
All right, friends, do you feel like you learned more about Gonzaga basketball, both in the last 10 years, last 5 years, last 5 months, and perhaps even the last 5 days after hearing from Andy? Andy runs a great show. Again, that's at Locked On Zags. Make sure you go check out the Locked On Zags podcast. Download, subscribe, rate, review, those kinds of things. Follow him at ScoreZagsScore on Twitter. You can follow this show on Twitter at F_N_sports. That's at F_N_sports on Instagram. We're also on Twitter at FNSports2. That's FINSPORTS 2. All one word on Twitter. Through both of those things, you can find links to our various sponsors, including my bookie, where you can use code FNSports to get double your deposit up to $1,000 US. You can use our code FNSports15 on thebeardstruggle.com to get up to 15% off of your various beard needs. You can also use our link to go to Yeti and get all of your different insulated cups, coolers, and koozies, whatever you need from there. You can also access our merch store through that link tree. And once you get to our merch store, you'll see that we have various different charitable t-shirts and hoodies, including the 42 collection for February Black History Month, in which all proceeds go to the Thurgood Marshall College Fund. You can also find all of our orange collection for Women's History Month next month. All proceeds from that go to Planned Parenthood of Greater Texas. Make sure you help us out and Women's History Month out with that orange campaign. It's already live, so you can go ahead and order that and have it in your hands for Women's History Month this March. As for me, you can find my stuff on Twitter and Instagram at Ainsworth512. That's PAINSWRTH 512 on Twitter or Instagram. You can find our intern Chris Sliwa, Chris_Sliwa7 on Twitter, or at Chris Sliwa7 on Instagram. He does all the editing